Good afternoon again, everyone. I've been seeing lots of faces who've been in the audience all day, so I hope everyone has been well fed and well caffeinated. Let's get straight into it. This is a really exciting and special session for us at the festival for multiple reasons. One is that we're celebrating a book. I'm going to actually say, Alison, sorry, I'm going to say we're launching because Trinidad and Tobago has not yet had a launch for the book. We are launching this book, Lost and Found, an A to Z of neglected writers of the Anglophone Caribbean. It's been launched in other places at other times, but this is the one that matters because it's here with us now, right? It's an important book because I think as many of us in the audience know, or if we don't know for a fact, we suspect, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of talented, interesting writers who have a lot to say to us now, but who we've completely forgotten about because of the conditions of the way literature has worked in the Caribbean over, in the 20th century especially. Lots of people who did not have access to publishing houses, lots of people who did not have access to literary festivals, to platforms like this to share their work. And what Lost and Found has done, and we'll let Alison tell you about it and not try to give you my inapt summary, but basically is found a series of writers, one for each letter of the alphabet except X, and I'll let her tell you about that. So 25 writers whose work we should know, we should read, should be in print, should be easily accessible, we should be studying, but for various reasons these writers have become obscure, and varying degrees of obscurity. Some of them are writers who we may know one or two pieces by them, maybe an anthology piece, or we've heard a title of a book, and some of them writers I'd never heard of before. So this book does some very important work of literary scholarship, but it's not a scholarly book in the sense that, yes, there's scholarship and research behind it, but it is a very accessibly written book that takes the form of biographies of these writers, tells us about the importance of their work, and basically reminds us that we have a much richer, broader, deeper literary heritage than we even know. So for all of that, I think we need to thank and congratulate Alison and the other contributors to the book. Alison, of course, has been to Bocas many times before, though it's the first time since COVID, so this is a nice welcome back. She is a literary scholar. She's British. She's currently based at the University of Bristol. Yes, I remembered correctly. But her field has always been Caribbean literature. She's edited, written, essays, books. She's done incredible work, especially, and I think for me, a lot of the most important work she's done is especially this, is in kind of recuperating writers who, for whatever reason, have fallen off the literary map. And in conversation with her this afternoon will be Ronald Cummings. Let's welcome him as well. Another familiar face at Bocas. Ronald is a Jamaican literary scholar, currently based in Canada. He's a contributor to the book, to Lost and Found, does a lot of important work himself in exactly the same thing, reminding us about this rich literary heritage and literary voices who perhaps are lost to the archives and bringing that back up to the light. So they're going to have a fascinating conversation about the book and all matters arising. And the special treat is that we're also going to hear short excerpts from 4 of the authors in the book. These are maybe writers you've never heard of before. Maybe it's just a name to you. These are all writers who, I think when you hear the excerpts, you're going to understand the importance of this kind of work. And I will let Alison and Ronald, tell you about the writers and tell you about the excerpts as they come up. So I just need to get out of the way now. Let's get the thing started. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Are they on?
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Thanks for coming.
It's great to be here in conversation with you, Alison. One of the things that maybe I'll begin by saying a little bit about how the session will proceed. So Alison and I will talk a little bit about the background for this project. And then, as Nicholas mentioned, there are some people who will read from the work of some of these writers. So we'll have a little bit of a conversation, 2 short readings. We'll talk again, and then closer to the end of the conversation, we'll have another 2 readings, all right? And we've decided to focus on 4 writers in this conversation because we have 1 hour to talk about all the richness that's in this book. So In terms of orienting us, I was trying to jog my mind because, as you note in the introduction, like this project has a long arc. Here you trace it back to your very first days in grad school. I'd love for you to talk more about that. But I was also trying to think about how I came into this project, since we're both here in conversation. And if my memory serves me correctly, and I'm not sure it will, I remember during the pandemic, there was a call that went out for an online digital project that is part of the archive of this book. So maybe we can also talk a little bit about, that online digital versioning of this project. But also at the time, there were all these interesting projects that were cropping up because it was in the middle of the pandemic. We were trying to figure out ways to be in conversation with each other. And it seemed like the project that you devised, and you can tell us about how you also came to that project, was just a rich way for us to be in dialogue across our different spaces. And then we have this rich book that follows that. So maybe we can talk about the archive of this project, and then we'll talk about the shape of this project.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And it's lovely to be in conversation because we're kind of companions in all of this work. And I think that's one of the most kind of fundamental things, I think, to say about the book. And my choice, in very many ways, I could have chosen the writers that only I have researched on and just published those, but I really wanted not to take the scaffold down and make it look as if this was just my work, because recovery work involves so many people as companion researchers, bringing lots and lots of different knowledge. So very many of academics in the field have been involved with this project, both the online version and the printed version, but also so many archivists and librarians, and then a whole kind of suite of co-researchers who have attachments to particular writers. And I'm thinking here mainly of relatives of the writers, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but actually also ex-pupils of the writers, friends of the writers. And so it's really felt important to me to be able to demonstrate that work like this is really collective. It's not individual scholarship in any way. It has been an individual obsession of mine for decades. And I still have the hardback books where I started to jot down names of writers that I knew nothing about. And it was in particular, for me, it was the women who were missing. So, I studied the mid-century, and, I thought all of the works I was taught were fabulous. In a sense, there was nothing missing in the canon, but I always knew that there was something missing in the canon. The women weren't there. And so I started to try and find them, and I found them really easily. They're not difficult to find. If you go to the X entry, I've listed all the names of the women who were published in BIM and Beacon and Focus and Kaiko Vorel. But what's difficult to find is, who were these women? So persistently, even when I found them, I would rush to the end of the anthology for the biographical notes. They're not included there. So what has taken me really decades is the kind of discovering who they were as writers, as Caribbean citizens, as community members often. So that's really been the journey of this. It has been 30 years. I did at one point propose to my long-suffering husband, who's here today, that the only way I could understand my project was to buy a filing cabinet and have a folder for every missing writer. But when we worked out how many filing cabinets we'd need, but really, I think one of the things that Nicholas was saying is, how do we live with that sense of loss? How do we know it's there around us unless we kind of materialize it in a way? So this has been a long project, a collective project, and I finally had really major research funding to work on this project during the pandemic. There was a snag there. We couldn't travel. So it became a way almost of kind of settling my nerves to go into my own library and start to pick out titles I actually had not paid attention to myself. And so I think I started with an A to Z of writers and then books and it became a kind of collective thing. And I think we all kind of found comfort in being connected through it. And then people would pitch in and say, I know an I, because I was like, who knows an I? You know? So it became this kind of nice sort of community thing. And then after that, Polly Patullo, who runs Fabulous Papillot Press, approached me and said, would you like to publish the book? And bless her, I think she thought I would publish the 500 words that I put on the internet. And suddenly, thinking about publishing it and talking, to Ronald and other scholars who've worked with me on the project, Marta Fernandez-Camper, who was our postdoc on the project and a very important part of this research, was to think, why do we want to do this and who do we want to read this? And I knew really that my academic career had started in a world where there was much more scope for things to take a long time. There was much more scope to return from research leave and say, I haven't really finished that. There was much more scope. So I think the demands were very different. And so I realized that the discoverability, the time taken to discover writers, is probably an obstacle to the work that so many of us recognize needs to be done. So as well as bringing back their biographies, I wanted to do bibliographic work. I see sort of bibliographic activism as really, really important. I'm very aware that beyond perhaps 3 or 4 writers in this collection, I don't have the time to do the work that they really deserve, the work of bringing their work back into print, the work of really properly attending to their writings and doing yet more discovery. So in a sense, it's a kind of map, I hope, of work to come, for the next generation.
Yeah, and also to say that, in coming back to this book for our conversation today, it made me also think about, Olive Senior's A to Z of Jamaican Heritage. And I think of this book, sort of like in that line of texts. And it's one of those source books that, we didn't know we needed it until we had it. And I feel the same way about this book. But I was also wanted to ask you, because they are discrete entries, and I'm struck by the sort of narrative impulse in them, that they're very about giving us a biography of these writers, in addition to the bibliographic entries that are there. But one of the things that's striking is how people show up across different entries. So, you're reading the piece about Dorothy Lavelle, and Monica Skeet shows up. Yeah. You're reading about Edwina Melville, and Claude Thompson is mentioned there. Can you talk about some of those messy lines and crossings?
Yeah, absolutely.
As part of this work?
I mean, I think, again, that's about the networks that we never mapped. So I think that the networks that we have really strong maps of are kind of London, Windrush maps. But the maps kind of for the writers who were shaping the nation at home were not so well developed. So, for example, the Grenadian-Barbadian writer Monica Skeet is really well known in Barbados because she was head of history at Queen's College for many years. But when I met with her pupils and said, well, she was a writer too, they're like, no, she wrote the school plays, but we didn't know. So this kind of sense in which women's authorship was really quite interestingly different, I think. I think professional authorship operated differently for many of the women that I've brought to attention here. And I think that means that when we're pulling on the threads from the established writers, we don't see them. We need new threads to pull on. And it's not that they're not there. It's not that they weren't encountering each other. But if we always go back and look through from the known, I think we're just not going to find them. They're not the same trees. We need to go to different, trees in the forest. But I also passionately wanted to restore them because the sense that I had had when I had been researching women writers, even of an earlier period, was always a sort of slight feeling that, well, they probably weren't that interesting. You know, what if you spend all this time and they're not that great? And that perhaps their lives were diminutive, or, you know, and really, like, when hopefully you will read some of these biographies, unsurprisingly, these women are absolutely extraordinary. You know, they did amazing things. They were, you know, writing was their way of making sense of a changing world, but not for a metropolitan audience, often for a local audience. And they did that in ways that were very powerfully influential for their pupils, their communities, publishing newspapers. And I think we're not looking for them in the right places, but once you do start to look for them, they tip up. And they tip up often in the same places. So it's almost like you can see, you know, if you were to sort of draw a map, you could see where the light falls and where the light hasn't fallen. And gatherings of writers are in there. And they're just as significant, I think, but it's a different model.
Okay, so for today's conversation, you have selected 4 writers for us to hear from their work. I wondered if you might want to say something about why these writers for this occasion.
Yes, I mean, it's an impossible task. Obviously, I have no favorites. It's very difficult. But I think I particularly wanted to choose all women for today, because not that there aren't really significant male writers who we've lost as well, or found as well, but because I think that probably the surprise is more how many women were writing during this period. And then I've tried to do a sort of across the region, so we can hear the variety of the voice, hopefully, but also very differently positioned writers in terms of, I think, what their objective was, what their experience was.
So the writers whose work we'll hear from are Barbara Jones, and Jamie Hibbert will be reading from Barbara Jones's work, Vera Bell, and I'll be reading something from Vera Bell's work. Edwina Melville, Ruth Osmond will be reading from Edwina's work, and Dorothy Lavelle and Aisha will be reading from Dorothy's work, Aisha Gibson-Gill. So maybe we'll start with the reading from Jamie of Barbara Jones's work.
You're all so quiet. So we want to give thanks and praise to the spirit of Barbara Jones. And what I want to believe is that she's here with us. And thank Alison and Ronald for the work that they're doing to bring these women to visibility. The piece is called West India. What can I say of my people? Ebony on ivory, walls of clime, hang green upon the lizards of the sun and shines, the cinnamon zephyr from the coral knives of seas. Cantonese from the Punjab, Yoruba, of the Thames Benin bronze, gleaming in a matador's prized air, to the Champs Élysées, of Caribs and Arawaks. Christopher, you betrayed my ancestors and the fetuses of their civilization. Weep, weep into the Mediterranean, sighing limp over the Niger, where the blue Nile sees no apparitions and hears not the white. Path winding on a razor's blunt edge of a moving history forbids me to hate your castanetted pleas for forgiveness. Fleur-de-lis, Drenched in blood, plantations of suspended souls fly and leap into armadas. Teutonic lions roar, devouring the droppings of the Niger, and the matador swings on the floor de lis. Christopher, you betrayed my ancestors. What then can I say of my people? I can say, distilled in a conquistador's thimble from black blood in the mango, wisdom of Confucius, cauldron with the fires of Krishna, the palm trees now view Venus and Jupiter under the chimneys which float across the bay into the sticks of sugarcane, and the drums beat out the witch's brew of my people. Thank you.
Just to say thank you there to Barbara Jones's niece, Joy Onyeka, who gave permission for this to be read today. That one is published, I think, in 1967. That's right. So
Okay.
we welcome. Are you here? Yeah, we're going to talk about the writers.
So we're going to have the readings. So
and then we're going to talk.
and then we'll have the conversation.
I'm really loving the urgency in this room. I mean, it's fabulous.
But do you want to say something quickly about Barbara Jones?
No, should we do the readings and then?
Okay.
Yeah. So
all right.
thank you.
So I'll be reading an excerpt from Viva Bell's story, The Bamboo Pipe. 3 notes on a bamboo pipe, that was all. But to Sun, they were the realization of a dream, the culmination of weeks of effort, of failure, and perseverance. And now he experienced all the satisfaction of an artist. For had he not fashioned this bamboo pipe with his own hands, and with his own breath created sound from it? But now, as others had done before him, he suddenly found himself in a material world and remembered with a shock that he was hungry, and that he had also forgotten to give the baby the sweetened bush tea his mother had left for it. And so Sun, having come back to earth, hastily tied his bamboo pipe to the string around his shoulder and went with a curious hesitation back to the room which he shared with his mother and the baby. He noticed with a sigh of satisfaction that the baby was no longer crying. All the previous night it had wailed, a strange, sickening wail, and at 5 o'clock this morning, when his mother had stumbled out of bed to walk to her work 3 miles away, she looked drawn and weary. Around a single hibiscus tree near the fence, a hummingbird dived and darted, like some strange spirit of beauty in this bare, dirty spot. Sun watched him idly, and his hand folded his pipe lovingly. He wished he could make a tune that would fit in with the hummingbird's dance, a long, trembling note here, then quickly up and down, in and out, little sounds jumping here and there. He sighed sadly, for his pipe had only 3 notes as yet. I'm going to invite Ruth Osmond to come and read from Edwina Melville's work.
And I just say thank you to Selena Bell, who is Vera Bell's granddaughter, and gave permission for that reading today. And in advance, I'll give thanks to Tondele Simone, who is Edwina Melville's daughter, and gave permission for this reading. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the work that you've done, both of you. The first time I heard about Edwina Melville, and it's sad, right? Because I'm a Guyanese writer. I like to think that maybe I am slightly well-read. The first time I heard about Edwina Melville was from you at the Guyana Prize Festival a few years ago, and my mind was was blown by her work and by the fact that there were people digging up, right, and bringing these wonderful writers to life. So I am honored to be able to read an excerpt. Can you imagine a thatched roof that does not whisper? There is nothing more still than a windless, moonlit night in the Rupununi savannas. Nothing more nostalgic and full of a strange, haunting charm all its own. The plaintive strum of a guitar accentuates the silence, and vaqueros looming in the shadowy night, their hands deftly weaving new cowhide lassos for the roundup, plait silently on, the rope sighing in swift, harsh jerks as they flick, switch, and pull taut. Mountains crouch away where they are quite close and loom near where they are far. A cow's horns glisten white and a bull mooing in the distance, poignant, sad, a mournful challenge in the silent night. Wispy rags of cloud stretch out across the moon's face. So much space up there. Clouds, stars, and a solitary moon. Air. Air that is full of voices. Limitless dome of heaven, so full of sound. Some men build slender steel pyramids to clutch the sounds out of the sky and transmit them for all the world to hear. Others simply press their hands together and their fingers form a pyramid that points to the sky, not to clutch so much as to pray. Tonight, a voice will come out of that sky and spiral along a thin wire and come out through a little black box the white man calls a radio. The batteries are low and need recharging, but the master is away from home. And the little mistress does not know how to start the charging plant and connect the web of wires. The knob snaps and a soft humming noise begins. Sitting down in the darkness, Nancy peered at the rosy dial and began to turn the rangefinder, praying that she had not turned on too late or too soon, because the batteries were low, and she had a hunch they would not last for her to hear the whole program. Tonight was the night they would read her story. She could hardly believe it, but the BBC in London had actually accepted her story, and tonight she would hear it.
Thank you. Our final reader will be Aisha Gibson-Gale, who will be reading from Dorothy Lavelle's work.
And I should just to say thank you to Barbara for giving permission, and to you because you're related to Dorothy.
Yes, Dorothy Lovell is my grandmother. And I'm reading an excerpt from Red Letter Day, which is actually in the book This Land Is Mine, that Barbara, my aunt, edited, collected my grandmother's works and put them together and self-published. The day began like any other in Maxine's orderly life. She'd risen from her bed the moment the familiar march had started on her Rediffusion speaker. Sylvan, her husband, slept on peacefully, snoring a little. The sky through the open window showed dark blue. It was going to be a fine day, and Maxine felt at peace as she sang along with the choir the hymn that marked the beginning of the early service on Rediffusion. It was not time yet to start the breakfast, so Maxine went into her yard and began to sweep. As usual, she could hear old Ma Connell next door doing the same thing. "Morning, Ma," she sang out. "Morning, child," Ma replied. "How's you this morning? It was kind of a ritual, and Maxine knew just what she would hear. I ain't rather tall, child. These toys ain't close for the night. The pains in the two knees nearly kill me. God dear, Maxine sympathized. But God say who we love each chastise, Ma Connell consoled herself. Maxine made a suitable answer and soon returned to the kitchen. By this time, Sylvan was awake and dressed. He and his wife conversed in the unself-conscious manner of people who spend much time together and feel at ease in each other's company. You find the white fowl yet? Sylvan asked. No, boy, the thieving people won't let she go. His question reminded her that she hadn't fed the fowls, and she fetched the tin of shelled corn and went to the door calling, "Chick, come, chick, 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 come." This is about 6 fowls the thief from you this year, Sylvan said noisily between sips of coffee. Yes, Maxine agreed. 3 when Miss Jones had the excursion, 2 at Easter, and now 1 more. I don't know how much more you're going to last before Christmas. Well, why you don't put them up? That's more trouble than profit, but I can't thief all. The rediffusion announcer's voice came clearly through the kitchen during a lull in conversation. The time is exactly 3.5 minutes to 8 o'clock. Hey, well, let me get hold of this place, boy. I know it's so late. Sylvan jumped out of the chair, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Soon he had got on his bicycle and was on his way, and Maxine watched him fondly as he rode out of sight. But a small sigh escaped her as she went back into the house. Hers was a happy marriage. There was no doubt about it. Sylvan was a considerate husband and a good provider. But after all these years, they still had no children. Well, Maxine said to herself, ashamed of her discontented feelings, can't have everything in this world. She pushed the thought to the back of her mind and set about to do her housework. Sylvan would be home by 12:15 for lunch, so she finished as soon as possible and prepared to go to the market to shop for the meal. The moment she came out of the door, she saw the bus passing on the main road and broke into a run, shouting, "Woo! Woo!" The conductor kept the bus until she got there. As Maxine climbed into the bus, panting and perspiring, a voice hailed her from behind. "Hey, Maxine girl, I ain't see you for long enough." Maxine turned around and recognized the girl who spoke to her. "Gloria, what are you doing down here?" "I going down at my aunt in Gibbs Road. How you keeping?" "I all right for the time being. How the children?" Maxine asked. Just then the bus gave a lurch as it narrowly avoided hitting a cyclist. After the slight commotion, Gloria continued, "I did see your husband up by me sometimes, you know." "Up by you?" Maxine looked puzzled. "When he come to look for the child, you know the girl knew say to live up that way." Maxine stared at Gloria in shock and surprise, unable to say anything.
A big thank you to all the readers. Alison, I wondered if you wanted to say something else about these writers, because they come to writing life in different ways, as one might discover in reading the entries, and I think there's something fascinating about that.
I mean, that's very true, and you might also notice that, the sort of texture of the writing. So for the pieces by Dorothy and Edwina, they were written for radio, and I think they both address that kind of acoustics in a really purposeful, beautiful way, completely differently. And so, I think, again, there can just be this assumption that if people haven't remained in view, it's somehow because they didn't really matter as much. And so it's really important for me for their writing to be kind of ventilated like this, so we can really feel like, I wish I'd studied those writers, I want to read more of them. Completely different stories. I mean, Barbara Jones, Trinidadian, but her writing did appear in Anson Gonzalez's Voices and New Voices. But apart from that, it was kind of published outside of Trinidad. And so it's really special to bring her into the room today and to say that, she had a kind of amazing academic career. She was, we believe, the first woman at least in her field, the first Caribbean woman to get a PhD in the US at Cornell in plant botany. And her collection of poems is called Among the Potatoes. And I only found Barbara Jones because Andy Tate, who some of you will know, a bookseller, has Black Rock Books in Barbados, knows that I will buy anything published by a woman. Particularly between, 1930 or 1920 and 1980. And he said to me, I have this funny little volume. And I said, does it meet the criteria? He says, yes. I said, I'll have it. Okay. And really from that discovery, I'm kind of pieced together this amazing career, which was always artistic and scientific, was profoundly political, transnational, absolutely. Just kind of so important. And we don't have enough time to give her credit today. But I hope there will be another occasion in Trinidad, because she has had more attention now in Canada, where I think her work, there's a lot of archives relating to her work there. And there's a lot of interest. And my co-researchers on this project, Aaron and Nalini, both are based in Canada, and were really able to kind of identify and help me pursue those archives. But, she's a really, really important figure and what's interesting is there was no critical language to receive her work at the time. Nobody really understood what was happening in her poetry and was able to kind of meet it on its own terms. And she speaks in such kind of powerful terms to us today, I think. Vera Bell, I'm sure many of you will know the poem Ancestor on the Auction Block. And it's probably the only thing you know of Vera Bell's. But she had a massive, she has a huge unpublished archive, and also, was very, very important in PMP circles. And for her, that kind of, what she calls in her diary, Birth of a Nation, and writing are really, really entangled and empowered by each other. So she's a really, really significant writer. And it's been fabulous. She's been one of my most rewarding research journeys, because it took me absolutely years and years to find her granddaughters. But when I did, they have been so enthusiastic, so sort of on the journey with me, and it's really fabulous. And I feel like, they now have, everything to bring her back. Dorothy. So Dorothy Lovell is the only writer who really never intended to write. Her works found publication through being identified as being so strong on the radio. So she was a storyteller. And so I think that's really fascinating, because what her career tells us, and much of her work, as with the other writers, is lost, and we may never find it, but we might. What I think that tells us is that whole other terrain that we will never find now, of that kind of literary work that is, because it didn't come into print and because many of the radio archives are lost, we really can't recover it. But how important that was, and so she really demonstrates. And also, voice in her work is just so spectacular. And they're not all humorous. Some of them are really sad. It's brilliant that Barbara Chase, her daughter, has published her stories, so they are accessible again. I would encourage anyone to have a look at those. And Edwina Melville, I'm not allowed favorites, but Edwina, I dream about Edwina. She's just had this really, really remarkable life, where she relocated from Georgetown in Guyana to the Rupununi and dedicated herself to representing the community there in every way. In the end, she ended up being their MP for the region, but also she ran a newspaper where she would tell people stories and publish them in their own names. And then she was, I think, truly the most astonishing writer. You probably heard a little bit in that story. She had an incredible kind of descriptive gift. She was really a kind of eco-warrior before we had that term. And so much of her work was lost because she had 2 metal crates of her stories, and the family got caught up in the Rupununi rebellion and had to leave for Brazil. And her papers were just found scattered. And it's really devastating, but we have been able to, by going back through magazine archives, I've been able to piece something of her career together. And many years ago, I interviewed Henry Swansea and asked him, of all the women broadcast on the Caribbean Voices, who did he think was particularly important? And he spoke about Edwina, and he was very kind of rueful and said, I often wonder what happened to her. So The Voice was published on the front page of the BBC magazine, The Listener, and only 2 stories from the whole Caribbean Voices programme were chosen for that, and hers was one of them. And it was the year that Swansea left Caribbean Voices. But I just managed, purely through chance, through an eBay search, to find a story of hers that was published in Blackwood's magazine, and to trace this whole correspondence that she had. Edwina is what we would now call an oversharer. So she has this incredible correspondence, both with Swansea and with Commander Blackwood. And the first story that he publishes in Blackwood's magazine is about her first visit to the Rupununi. And when he publishes it, she writes to say to him, I'm so grateful because this money means I can go to town to have my baby. And she's telling him all of this domestic history, and we learn so much about her life in this literary correspondence. So these writers kind of transform how we think about not just literature, but correspondence, archive, network, infrastructure, professional authorship. So I think it's really bringing them back into view, really disrupts so many of the assumptions we had that writers were writing for metropolitan audiences and for commercial return. These writers were not interested in that.
Yeah. I mean, one quick thing I'll say is I also appreciate that you've included pictures in the book. I know this was important to you.
Yeah.
And certainly with the entry that I wrote, it was a long archival search to find one picture of Claude Thompson. And I think it brings them, as you said, into view in a sort of real and material way in the context of the text. We might have space for 2 quick questions. So we're going to take 2 questions and then Alison's response and then wrap up the session. There's a hand over there.
Hi, good afternoon. It seems like you did a lot of work on this publication. Are there any other authors that you have that haven't been made into the book? And is there going to be another book or another way of disseminating these authors and bringing them to light? And
So in a way, the A to Z structure was also a way of saying, how could I possibly choose of all the many writers? Let me just choose that way, because it's almost like saying that it shows you how many there are, that we could pick the alphabet. I mean, I've cheated a little, as you'll see. But basically, we could do that. There are absolutely so many more. But this is really slow work. And really, in a sense, what I hope it will give is confidence and sort of to other people to research those writers they've always wanted to know. Because I guess I've been really cheered by how much I have found when I was told, oh no, all of that is lost. And I've done it, so one of Edwina's sons, I met up in Letham in the Rupununi, and he pulled out his wallet and he pulled out the newspaper advert that I had put in the newspaper in Guyana that he had seen, asking about, did anyone know his mother's work? So I feel like we're really possibly just on the threshold of still being able to find more. I feel like there are lots of people are holding on to papers that don't really know, are these important? Are they not important? So, I think this is probably me done, but I hope it's not the work of the project done. And for me now, what I want to do is start editing the writer's work. So I'm starting to do that, to bring editions of their writing back into print, because I think that's That's what they deserve, and that's what they need. And the Digital Library of the Caribbean, I should say, have been amazing partners on this. So there's a lot of digital resources available on these writers. And I think we could bring back quite a lot digitally. But it was interesting to me when I spoke to relatives, what would you like to see? They wanted to see a book. It was important to them to have a kind of recovery in a book. And, I get that. I'm a book person. But I do also feel like we probably can use other platforms as well to begin to kind of, recover and increase visibility.
Any other questions?
Hi, what's the story of No Z? Sorry, X.
Oh, so X stands for all of the writers that we don't know about still. So I've listed in there all the women who were published in all the literary magazines. And I think it's really quite shocking to think how many were and how many, I think I kind of uncovered a lot of my own prejudices when I was doing this research. I realized that when I was, doing my own graduate research, I read I was really lucky to be at Warwick University, which has an amazing collection. But one thing I didn't really read enough of was school textbooks. I'd internalized that kind of hierarchy of what the literary was and what it wasn't. And now I've gone back to all of those school textbooks. I found so many brilliant stories by these women in there. So I think, for me, however much this project, I'm really glad it's done, but I don't want us ever to think it's done, So in a sense, I wanted there to be a kind of space for that loss within the project.
We have time for one more question.
What were the other 3 countries the ladies were from?
Vera Bell, Jamaica, and then migrated when she was 50 to the UK.
Yes.
Edwina Melville, Guyana, but some time in Brazil. And Dorothy Lovell, Barbados, I believe, her whole life.
All right, thank you. That's what I wanted to know, because it was like a little out of context when we were hearing the stories.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to the readers for these fantastic readings of this work. Earlier in the conversation, I invoked Olive Senior's A to Z of Jamaican Heritage. It was published in 1983, and then in 2003, 20 years later, she went back and gave us the Encyclopedia of Jamaican Heritage. So I'm hoping there will be more expansions, more developments, and more volumes emerging from this work. Thank you again, Alison, for this wonderful detective work that you've done.
Thank you. And I always say this because it's the most important thing to say. If anybody knows anybody who knows anybody who knows anybody or anything, please do let me know.
Next in this room will be Cheryl Boyce Taylor in conversation. Thank you all for being a fantastic audience.